All right, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Irina Gerry. Irina is a purpose-driven entrepreneur and marketing leader on a mission to transform the food system and drive widespread adoption of sustainable ways to feed the world. She is a chief marketing officer at Change Foods, a precision fermentation food tech company creating animal-free dairy products. Prior to joining Change Foods, Irina spent 5 years working on two of the largest plant-based food and beverage brands, Silk and So Delicious. Irina has over a decade of experience in consumer marketing space with global giants Procter Gamble and Danone, as well as a business strategy and operations with Deloitte. Irina holds an MBA from Harvard Business School. And with that, I'll present our next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam, and welcome everybody. It is such an honor to be here and truly an honor to follow Marion today. I want to take a slightly different spin when we talk about food systems. And I want to talk about innovation and what's coming and how can we make it better, more exciting. And I also want to talk about sustainability and take a deeper dive into that aspect of what plant-centric food systems can do. Growing up, I'm sure like most of you, food was never about these big picture issues. It was about getting together with my family for dinner, enjoyment, it was about connection, it was about holidays. And being with family, being with friends, it was about nourishment and nurture and all those things. And it was about pleasure. It was really about me. As Sam mentioned, I spent the last 10 years of my life deep diving into food. You know, it started with forks over knives. I'm sure most of you have seen that. You know, and learning about plant-based foods and what they can do for our health. Then I progressed into learning about climate and how food and climate are connected and how what we eat impacts the planet we live on. And then later, in the subsequent years, I started learning more and more about industrialized animal agriculture and all of the issues that come with it. So it's kind of a snowball that keeps on unrolling. And once you really start learning, you can't stop, right? And so food started with this kind of a simpler meaning, more about me, and evolved into something more about we. However, I think when we think about food, we really have to keep both of those in mind because ultimately, we are all individuals and we make choices individually every day, and those two things come together. And today, you all know, we share a planet with 8 billion people. What do you think it takes to feed 8 billion of us? How much land, water does it take to put food on the table for those of us lucky enough to have it 3 times a day? And what do you think of the consequences of this food system, this big production that Marion mentioned? Well, today our food system as a whole accounts for over a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. It uses 50% of all habitable land on this planet. So we as species use about 1% of the land for our urban infrastructure, all the homes, roads, and factories. And we use 50% of our habitable land to grow food. It requires a ton of our freshwater resources, especially here in California. I'm sure it's a very salient point. Growing food requires a lot of water. And unfortunately, the way we do this today with pesticides and industrialized agriculture is creating a lot of pollution, both in the air and in our water. And here's the kicker. Excluding humans, livestock actually represents 94% of global mammal biomass. This is livestock industry's version of biodiversity. That has a tremendous impact on the mass extinction, the 6th largest extinction that we're living on this planet today, and is largely driven by deforestation and the expansion of agricultural systems. So this is massive, right? This is an incredible amount of negative information, right? So what are we going to do, right? What do we look at? And any which way you look at our food systems, raising livestock for food carries an outsized impact. So of all of the land that we use to produce food, actually, the kind of combined area of North and South America is required for livestock. So this is grazing and then growing the feed crops like corn to feed the animals. while it's only supplying 18% of our calories. So there's this massive difference and massive inconsistency between the amount of resources we dedicate to livestock and the amount of food it produces. And in this country, because we have such a meat-centric diet, we actually use 41% of continental United States just to feed and raise livestock, and only 4% to grow the food that we can eat directly. So again, this is a mind-blowing number. We are a cow country. We have 100 million cows in this country, and by weight, they outnumber all of the Americans. And we use 40% of our land to feed them. Globally, if you zoom back out, again, I know there's this kind of narrative in popular ecosystem, well, raising all these animals is not a big deal because they eat, grass and we can't eat grass. Well, guess what? We actually do use 1/3 of global cropland to grow food for the animals. In this country, we use 65% more cropland to grow food for the animals than we do to grow food for humans. So it has a massive implication to food systems justice, to hunger, etc. It is a leading driver of tropical deforestation. I'm sure you guys are familiar with the problems that are happening in the Amazon. Vast majority of the land cleared in the Amazon is getting cleared for cattle ranching and then soy, which goes into the cattle feed, not tofu. And then just livestock alone. So total food systems is about 1/4 of our emissions, but livestock alone is over half of that, clocking at about 16%. This is bigger than the whole transportation sector combined, all cars, trains, planes, etc. So when you get upset about people at Davos flying in on private jets, this is a tiny, tiny fraction in emissions compared to the animal-centric system that we have for our food. What do we do, right? And the bigger thing to really think about is methane emissions. I know we're all focused on, fossil fuels and CO2, and that's a massive contributor to climate change, and fossil fuel industry is very important. But methane is coming from predominantly three sources. One is livestock, and that is actually the leading source ahead of oil and gas. Oil and gas sector, and then waste, so landfills. Across those three, this is about the majority of human-produced methane emissions. And methane is absolutely critical because it's actually incredibly powerful greenhouse gas. So on a 20-year basis, it is 84 times more powerful at warming the planet than CO2. It's also a short-lived gas, so if you cut it, it's only in the atmosphere for about 12 years, and then it breaks down into CO2, another kind of interesting thing, right? So people say, oh, no big deal, it only is in the atmosphere for 12 years, don't worry about it, just breaks down into CO2, and we all know there's not a problem with CO2, so all is fine. But while it is in the atmosphere for those 12 years, it does a lot of warming, it does a lot of damage, and the United Nations issued a report saying we must reduce methane emissions by at least 40% in the next decade. Well, guess what? 32% of it is coming from livestock. So we must address this, and we really cannot do this. There's really not a way to get around methane without addressing animal agriculture. And the problem is, as much as we all know and talk about plants and how wonderful they are and how sustainable they are, what's happening in the world is as the rising middle class is coming up in Africa, in Asia, in India, the demand for meat and dairy is just absolutely staggering, and it continues to rise. And we are looking at a 50% higher demand for meat and dairy and animal products in the coming, by 2050, with the trends that we have today. So as much as we talk about plants, and I love plants, and I'm very much for plants, this is not what's happening in the real world. And the system that we have, as damaging as it is today, is looking to grow. So we must transition to plant-centric food systems. I think that's very clear. It's clear from a planetary perspective. It's clear from health perspective. And yet we seem to have a problem where that is not currently happening. Why? Well, people love eating meat and dairy. There's a massive amount of advertising, lobbying, and marketing that goes into it. It tastes good, right? Let's be honest. A majority of people enjoy the taste of animal foods. And there's so much marketing that goes behind it. It's pervasive, it's available, it's cheap. There are a lot of issues that drive this. But human desire, culture, tradition, all feeds into this, right? So going back to this me versus we conversation, many of us in this room, and especially if you kind of step outside of the Berkeley bubble, this is the epicenter of food, right? We have these meat-centered plates and diets that we have. And whole food plant-based, which I'm a huge fan of, a very, very big fan of, it's hard to maintain. It's hard to maintain for even people in this country. It requires a lot of cooking. I like cooking. I do it every day. I destroy my kitchen 3 times a day. It is a massive time resource, right? And chopping is kind of what you have to do. Many people don't have the resource. They don't necessarily have the time. Maybe they don't have the skills. They don't want to put in the investment when the comparison is an easy burger from McDonald's for a few bucks. That tastes great in the moment, right? And that's what we have to struggle with is cognitively, kind of from a health perspective, that's the way to go, and yet practically that's not where we end up. So, and plant-based foods are kind of like let's rig the system, right? Let's give people the foods they like meat and dairy, but just make them out of plants. Great idea. However, a lot of the plant-based alternatives are still lacking. They're lacking in taste, they're lacking in nutrition, and I spent 6 years of my life working for Silk, plant-based milk, so I'm a huge fan of those, and yet they're not working exactly for everybody. So if you look at the plant-based food as we have it today, it's only 4% of total food. And milk is the most successful category, and it's only 16%. I know we get really excited, especially those of us who work in it. We're like, yes, plant-based milk, And I love it. It's in my fridge every single day, but it's still 16%. When you look further down the funnel of plant-based foods, cheese, measly 1.5%. I worked on Silk cheese, So Delicious cheese. It's not quite hitting the spot, right? If you're looking for that pizza experience, if you're looking for that pasta lasagna dish that your grandma used to make, it's a tough, proposition to replicate the experience, right? And so many people are not quite coming along. Same thing with plant-based meat. I know Bloomberg article made a lot of noise last week saying, plant-based meat is a fad. I don't believe it's a fad. I believe there are really good reasons for it to exist, and it must continue to exist, and it is going to get better, but it hasn't quite gotten us to a point where we are really truly can say that is a way to kind of give people what they're seeking, right? Same thing with eggs. I mean, egg prices have gone up. I don't know if you guys have shopped for eggs lately. It's like I spent $11 on a carton of eggs the other day. They're fancy, organic, high welfare eggs, but that's insane. Egg prices are 50%, and the sales have only trailed off by like 3. So people are just buying their eggs no matter how much they cost. So what do we do, right? And I think that's why I wanted to kind of draw a slightly bigger circle around the food system, because yes, we should eat more plants. I think there's undeniable reasons for everybody to continue to push for whole food plant-based diet or a plant-centric diet or predominantly plant-based diet. I'm very much in the same page with Marian and Michael Pollan, like eat mostly plants, right? Whole foods, mostly plants. We can farm better. We have an agricultural system that is currently quite degenerative or extractive, right? Whether it's animals or plants, the way we do kind of monocropping and everything is very problematic. The issue with it's very efficient, and it's delivering a lot of cheap foods and accessible foods to humanity. So as romantic as the idea of, everybody can go organic and regenerative and, have these kind of lo-fi food systems, is hard to reconcile with the 8 billion people and the cost that this food costs. So today, organic food on average is about 20% higher price-wise, right? That's a tough sell to developing countries. Regenerative agriculture, especially when you talk about regenerative meat, is kind of like more of a unicorn situation, like good luck finding that magical beef. If you do, let me know. But it doesn't really exist, and it's undefined, and it's hard to do. So there's a lot of work we still have to do to define what regenerative agriculture is. How could we keep it how can we keep producing the amount of food that we want and the variety of the food that we want? And how can we keep the cost down? So there's a lot of questions we still have to wrestle with. But again, it is one of the solutions. Absolutely, we have to pursue this. And if we're going to keep animals in our food systems, and there are good reasons to do so, right? A, people are not going to give up meat. B, people in poorer countries and nutritionally deficient people could benefit from some meat consumption, right? Animals have been in part of our food systems forever. They can eat, stalks of corn that we don't eat, so there's food system kind of upcycling that we can do. So there are reasons to keep animals in our food system, but how do we do it in a way that is not absolutely demolishing ecosystems and creating these cruel concentrated feedlot systems that you can drive down Central Valley, California, and the smell hits you from miles away, right? I highly recommend a road trip. You will see it's like deserts, cows, and almonds. We have like 2 monocrops in this state, and they're absolutely destructive to the environment. But we can do animal agriculture better. The question is, how much of it can we do? And then what do we do with the rest of the system? So what I want to talk to you about, and it's sometimes feel like there are 2 dichotomous ideas, right? We have kind of this whole food, plant-based, organic, back to nature idea, and then we have this kind of a food technology, let's rig the system and give people what they want, made better idea. And I don't think they're contradictory. I actually think they're complementary, because when you put this back in perspective of 8 billion people, of the amount of food we need to produce, the habits we have, the cultural connection we have, the momentary decision-making that people make about food when it is about me and it's Friday night and I want the pizza, right? And I'm with my friends and I'm not going to be the fancy vegan and ask for a kale salad, right? Or if grandma's coming over for dinner and I want to make the lasagna recipe. It is a tough sell. Trust me, I tried. I did like a side-by-side lasagna with plant-based cheese, and it was a disaster. Like, nobody wants to eat it. I'm like, okay, well, I tried, right? So I think those are complementary solutions. So I don't mean to juxtapose them. I think you need both in order to kind of create this better food system, keeping in mind that overall I'm still very much in the camp of whole food, plant-based, predominantly plants, right? But let's talk about what are these different, so there's kind of 3 different technologies I want to talk about. One is cultivated meat and cell-cultured seafood. So what that is literally taking a cell from an animal, a small biopsy, you can go and get a little prick, and get a few cells, and you can actually grow those cells in a bioreactor. So in a way, you're kind of using biotechnology, you're recreating a process that an animal would have inside of its body, where a body supplies nutrients and cells grow, right? That's what it takes to go from, calf to a cow. So you take some cells, you put them in the bioreactor, and you feed these cells nutrients, and obviously it's complicated biotech, but you basically incite cell division, right? And when you do that, you can do that in a small, facility with these giant, bioreactor vats where you literally can grow meat. The advantage is it's the exact meat cells, so it tastes like meat, it has the nutrition of meat, it looks like meat, smells like meat, etc., right? It's just you don't have to grow the hooves and the feathers and corn and all of the ghost acres that it takes to create the cow. It's kind of weird right now. I think most people kind of say that's a cool idea. I like the science of it. Sounds weird, right? But nonetheless, we've been, this technology is coming. It's being developed right here in Berkeley. Upside Foods is down the street from here. So I think it is an exciting idea if you think about what if we could grow meat without growing the animals, right? And you can do seafood, you can do all kinds of things. So that's one bucket. The other bucket of technology, click. Okay, it's called precision fermentation. This is Change Foods is a company I work for. This is kind of my little pillar of the world. So this is where we, instead of growing cells, we can take a simple organism like a bacteria or a yeast, a single-celled microbe, and we can, again, use biotechnology. So we can take a DNA sequence from a cow. We don't need the cow at all. We actually just copy and paste it from a DNA database. It's literally like a string of code. So you take the string of code and you pluck it into the microorganism. So you use the bioengineering techniques to do that. And you essentially create an organism that now, when fermented, kind of like brewing a beer, where you take a bunch of these microbes, you stick them in a fermentation tank, and you put water and sugar and a few nutrients, and they start doing their microbial thing, kind of like kombucha. But instead of producing, alcohol, as in case of beer, they're cranking out milk protein. So you're brewing dairy. You're using the microbes as little tiny machinery to brew dairy. This is how Impossible Foods uses microorganisms to brew their heme protein, because what they did is they identified that the heme protein in meat is what gives it kind of that bloody color, that texture, that meaty taste. And so they're using fermentation to produce this one ingredient. So the rest of the burger is plant-based, but that's kind of the secret ingredient that makes the plant-based burger taste more meaty. In our case, we're making casein proteins, which are milk proteins that is what kind of the key ingredient in cheese. So we can make a mostly plant-based cheese, but by adding those casein proteins, we can create plant-based cheese that actually melts and stretches and has that gooey texture of cheese, and has the nutrition of a dairy cheese. So it's not just oils and starches. Perfect Day is a company also out of the Bay Area. They're making whey protein. So think of your whey protein powder. You can go get a GNC store. Well, now we could make that exact whey protein powder. We don't need to raise the cows and do all the things to cows to then extract the whey from the milk and create 99% of waste in the process. We can just create the whey protein. So the sustainability profile of this technology is absolutely astounding. And the last one is called biomass fermentation. So this is where you take, usually it's a fungal strain, so think of them as mycelium strains. So they're kind of the root bodies of mushrooms. So not the top of the mushroom, but the network of roots. And you can take some of these strains are actually incredibly nutritious. They're amazing. They're whole food. They come with high quality protein on par with beef and chicken, many of them. They also have a ton of fiber because that's naturally a fibrous substance. And they have like vitamin B12 because guess who makes B12? It's actually microbes, not cows. So these proteins can have an amazing nutritional profile. They're much closer to whole food. They're still processed in a sense that you grow them in also fermentation tank. And then usually you will squeeze them or powder them. There's a company, Meaty Foods, out of Colorado. There's a number of companies actually in the Bay Area that are making, chicken nuggets and deli meats and you name it. And again, they have a much, much better nutritional profile. And if flavored correctly, could substitute for animal foods, right? Company corn has been in market for 20 years with this. So consumed safely, nobody has an issue. So why would we do this, right? Like these, okay, they're kind of processed foods. They're kind of weird. Like, why would we do this, right? So one reason is, okay, well, people are not going to give up meat, so let's give them the better version of meat and dairy. The other reason is decarbonization. So bringing you back to the emissions, right? The livestock emissions, 16% of global emissions, more than a third of global methane emissions. Well, guess what? If we just shift 8%, so not everything, we're not greedy, right? We just want 8% of the protein sector. And if we switch that over to alternative protein, so you can still have your fruits and veggies and kale salad, but we just shift the 8% of the protein sector over to these alternative proteins, it's going to deliver 0.85 gigatons of CO2 worldwide by 2030. Well, what does that mean? That's basically like decarbonizing 95% of the aviation sector. That's massive. Aviation sector is very hard to decarbonize. There is not currently a sustainable fuel alternative. They can put planes from New York to LA at all. Whenever you hear about sustainable fuel or net zero by 20, that's all BS. There's not a technology today that can do this. And we're not going to stop flying anytime soon. I don't think so. In fact, we're on kind of like this revenge travel mode. I think everybody's seeking to get on the plane. So so we can either try to do that really hard thing, which we should still do, right? And that technology might come in the future with hydrogen fuels and other fuel sources. But up until then, we can do this other thing and deliver just as great of a benefit, which I think is really powerful. So I know this is kind of a quick hits thing. What can you do, right? So I wanted to kind of leave you with a little bit of what's next. And I will leave you with 3 thoughts. First of all, please learn more. These technologies are new. They're very exciting. There's obviously a lot of different questions that you might have. How do you make the meat cells, and is it safe? And, have people been eating this? And, all of that stuff. So I think there's a ton you could learn. So Good Food Institute is a wonderful resource. RethinkX is a really interesting think tank that talks about future food systems and what they could look like, and what does the disruption from a economic and business perspective look like to the animal agriculture sector, and what can these technologies do. And Our World in Data is a wonderful source. Marian used one of the charts where you could literally go and dig in and look at water use per kilogram of food, land use, what causes deforestation. It's an incredible resource that I think everybody should have saved on their browser. I do a lot of speaking and talking and get in trouble with beef people online, so follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter. I tend to just share a lot of kind of different knowledge and tackle a lot of the arguments that people have and a lot of kind of what about questions that come up. So my feed is kind of fun. I also write a column on Green Queen Media. If you're not familiar, Green Queen Media is kind of a big sustainability platform. They talk about, obviously, food, but also packaging and other things that are related to kind of all things sustainable technologies. I also think you should get involved, right? I know a lot of you really care deeply about the future that you are inheriting and what can you do. There's actually an incredible array of opportunities for you to be involved. So there are 200 startups. I think 100 of them are in the Bay Area in this new sector. It is incredible. Like, you could throw a rock and land at a really cool food company in this area. And they're all hiring. It's amazing. There's not been much of a recession when it comes to food tech companies. If you want to do a big consulting company, Accenture, BCG, Deloitte, McKinsey, they're all developing sustainable food practices within their consulting business. So if you still want to go and polish off your resume and do consulting, I did that for 3 years, you can do that, and you can become part of that practice and learn a lot. Venture capital, so if you're into finance, you could find your way into deploying finance in a way that actually creates a better food system. There are funds now that only invest in these new food technologies and sustainable food businesses. So I think it's incredible. They also need a lot of people because the depth of knowledge needs to be developed there. So I think it's an incredible path for somebody who is interested in finance. If you want to do big food, just about every large food company is also looking at this because they know. Even my former employer, Danone, is under the gun. A lot of their emissions come from animal agriculture. They were the first company to announce that they're now going to measure their methane emissions and they're going to measure their scope 3, and guess what? They have a problem. They have a problem because all of their yogurt comes from cows, and these cows make a lot of methane emissions. The top 15 meat and dairy companies produce more emissions than Shell and Exxon and Chevron. So they need to figure this out, and they're starting to feel the heat from the regulators, from the ESG movement, and from the public at large saying, well, what are you guys doing about this, right? So you can be inside of one of those companies and work on bringing these technologies in to the food system. And if nothing else, you can be a climate hero for breakfast. With your food choices, you can make a massive difference, not only for yourself, for your health, but I also feel like because food is so social, our food choices actually echo back to our social circles, right? It's when you make certain food choices, you impact what your friends think about, what they feel, how they engage. When you decide to cook an amazing plant-based meal, you can introduce somebody to a new experience, right? They may not go vegan overnight, but they might say, hey, that thing you made, that wasn't half bad, I'll do that again. Great, right? If you can inspire your friends to go plant-based, if you can talk to your school or about the meal choices and what is available into your cafeteria, there are so many ways that we can create action in our daily lives that can then kind of create this ripple effect. So I will leave you here, and I am happy to take questions if we have time. I don't know.
Just a bit behind schedule, so we might only have time for one question. So make it good.
Make it spicy.
Hi, yeah, thank you for speaking with us. I was just wondering, because one of the problems that we talk about a lot in food systems is who is controlling our food system. And I was wondering how you can make the argument that this isn't just a lateral move that keeps control of the food system in the hands of a few, particularly in like biotech, and how this just might fit into the narrative of like feeding the world versus letting people feed themselves.
Yeah, well, I'll say two things about it. One is a lot of these biotech companies are startups, so they're not necessarily controlled by big food. And I get that that's the concern, right? We have such a aggregation of systems at the top among large conglomerates. So at this moment today, most of these companies are startups. They might take some money from big food companies, but they're not owned or controlled by big food companies. So that's one thing I'll say. The other one is I think the theory of change is just different, right? I I think I'm with you guys in frustration with how our food system is so concentrated and rigged, and there's corporate interest, and they lobby and they advertise and they do all this stuff. But there's also kind of this reality of, well, this is the system we have. I think we could work to try to dismantle it somehow, or we can kind of plug in and say, well, let's make this system better, right? I can protest JBS and Tyson and Danone and be really mad, or I could say, you know what, Tyson, I'm going to give you an amazing cultivated meat product, and let's work together, and let's use your distribution systems, your influence, your networks, your people that you have, and make money on it. So it's a different way of attacking the problem. I understand it's philosophically not appealing sometimes, right? Because we want something that's more distributed, more just, more different. But some people just say, look, if we can't dismantle it, let's just rig the matrix, right? And let's make the matrix work better. The other thing that a lot of these technologies offer is that this food supply can be localized, right? These fermenters, they don't require vast fields of land. They don't require slaughterhouse networks. I can put a bunch of fermenters. In fact, my company, we're building a plant in the UAE because they have no dairy. Really, they have no fields. They can't bring. They brought 10,000 cows last year because they really wanted some food independence. So they hauled in 10,000 cows on a ship, and now they have to feed and water the said cows. Guess where the hay comes from? It's shipped from Arizona, where we're using our precious California water from Colorado River to water the hay in the desert to then ship it to the UAE for the cows. How crazy is that? So instead of doing that, why don't we just build a few fermenters and replace all of that output? And guess what? They have a lot of sun, so we could put solar panels and run it on a more sustainable energy system, right? So there is a way to design this thoughtfully and bring a little bit more of that food sovereignty and a little bit more of that food independence into regions of the world that don't currently have it. So I think it's a nuanced conversation, but it's a fair question. Thank you, guys.